Welcome and thank you for joining us again for a new webinar from Clever Languages. As usual, we're very glad to have you here. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which is on creating routines and engaging lessons for elementary world language classes. And we are very happy to have Josefina Cabello here with us. She has been in the classroom for almost 15 years. In her home country, she taught ESL for 6 years and she has been a Spanish teacher in the US since 2013 and currently teaches Spanish to PK to 6th grade, sorry, and she's currently working towards her MAT in Spanish and ESL education. Josefina, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to be here today. We are going to be sharing everything about routines from arrival to dismissal. As Sabrina said, well, I am a Spanish teacher. I've been in the classroom for 11 years teaching Spanish. And before that, I taught ESL for 6 years. But I've always been a teacher who sees students like on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So today we'll be talking about what can we do as educators to establish a routine in our classroom. So we're going to share the importance of routines and schedules in a world language class. We're going to do that today. We are also going to be going over examples of routines in a world language classroom for preschool. And those of you who teach upper grades, we're going to go and talk about what we do for routines for a classroom in upper elementary and lower elementary. So that's a little bit of what we're going to be doing the day of today. And first of all, we are going to see why is it important to have a routine? Why is it important to have a schedule? So if we can go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the importance of routines in our classrooms. Like, why is it important for us as educators to have routines, to have a schedule, to have procedures? So if we can go to the next slide, if you teach multiple levels, like if you are a teacher who sees kindergarten, first grade, second grade, you don't have like just one group of students, it can be a challenge teaching multiple levels. So if you see your students on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, it's challenging to establish a routine. Not only that, it's also challenging to build relationships, which are essential to build a classroom community and a sense of belonging. With this being said, sometimes our students might see our world language classes as free time or as a recess, and especially if you have like teachers like dropping off the students in your classroom and they're like, okay, well, have fun. So our students feel like our classroom is not really like a class. Sometimes they see it as a break. That's number one. And number two, kids do not learn from people that they don't feel like they have a relationship with. So it's important for us as educators to foster and build that relationship with students so they can see that, you know, your teaching is essential for them, and what you have to share with them is also very important for their education. So we can go for the next slide. So what happens with the attention spans of preschoolers? If you teach preschool students, you are going to realize that their attention span is very short. If you have an activity where they have to sit on a rug, where they have to stay still, it's not going to last long. So it's generally accepted that a child can concentrate or they can maintain their focus for 2 to 3 minutes for their age. For example, the attention span of a 3-year-old, it's approximately 6 to 9 minutes. For a 4-year-old, it's approximately 8 to 12 minutes. And for a 5-year-old, it's approximately 10 to 15 minutes. So in average, the attention span of a preschooler is less than 15 minutes. So if you have a 30-minute class and you expect your students to sit on the rock for 30 minutes with the same activity, that's not going to happen. So something that you can do is prepare or have ready 3 or 4 activities so they can be switching activities every now and then. If you have them for more time, like for 45 minutes, same thing. You can allocate different activities so they can be moving, they cannot be sitting still, because that's when the chaos starts to happen in the classroom, when they are not engaged and when they are starting to get bored, because again, their attention span is very short. So we can move on to our next slide. And what is important of schedules? And honestly, schedules is something that it's not only just for children or just for students, it's also for humans. Like what happens to us, like if you go on a trip and they cancel your flight, you start panicking. It's a human reaction to feel panic or feel stress or feel anxious when you do not know what's going to happen. Like we have a daily routine. We know we get up, we go to work, we come back, rinse and repeat Monday to Friday. But what happens when something unexpected happens, like when we don't know what's going to happen? That's when we as humans, we start getting worried, and it can show up in different ways. Now imagine that on a small child that's 3, 4, 5 years old. When they come to a classroom, they do not know what to expect. They're used to have the routines in their classroom with their homeroom teacher. They come in, they drop off their backpacks, they know where to put their lunchbox, they have centers, they know exactly the routine they have in their classroom. But when they come to our classroom, to their world language classroom, to Spanish, French, German, any language that you're teaching, they do not know what to expect, and especially if they're not in the same room where they have their classes. So when we have a schedule, when we have a set of allocated activities, our students know what to expect from your class. They know exactly what's going to happen. With this being said, it's going to be easier for you to keep them engaged. Like if you have a song at the beginning of the class, they know they have to be ready for the song. If you have a game, they know they want to participate in the game. So it's going to be easier for you to keep them engaged. And also, if they know what's going to happen, it's going to be less time for you to go over instructions and expectations during the first minutes of your class. As a personal experience, I started teaching Spanish 11 years ago, and I found out that my 30-minute classes, I spent the first 15 minutes giving instructions of my expectations, like what I wanted them to do, how I wanted them to behave, how I wanted them to just sit on the rug and listen. But once we had a routine and we stick to that routine, I did not have to spend more than 3 minutes telling them, hey, when you come to my room, let's sit on the rug. And they know what's going to happen. We sing a song, then we read a book, then we have an activity, then we watch a video or do a game, but they know exactly what's going to happen. So you're going to spend less time explaining to them what the activities are or what are your expectations about their behavior in your class. We can move on to the next slide. And this is an example of what happens in my classroom with the arrival. When they come to my classroom, I give them those little cards that you see on the left. So I place one card on the rug. So my students are expected to find the match. So they know exactly where they're going to sit. And for them, it's a game. For me, it's a time saver because they know exactly where they sit. That's one activity that I do. Another thing, if you have your own classroom, it's very important for you to mark spots where your students are supposed to walk. I know it sounds very like you may be thinking like, oh, this is very silly. Like, what? Why should I do that? But trust me, if your students are not used to be in your classroom, one student can be walking around your desk, another student can be walking around another desk, and suddenly you have like students walking in 10 different directions. So it's very important for you to mark their spots where you want them to walk. If they're going to the rug, if they're leaving the room, it's very important for you to mark those spots. Those are like some vinyl circles that you can find on Amazon or any other store, and they are very helpful. Also, when it's time to line up, you can tell students, hey, each one of you stand up on one circle so we can line up. So it's very visual for them, and it's going to really save you a lot of time. Another activity that we do is that we have our morning routines. And for that, we have this wall that you see here. So we have our calendar, we have our numbers, we talk about feelings, we talk about colors. So my students know that once they come to my room, their attention should be to my bulletin board, because they know we're going to start doing our morning routine. So if you have one spot completely dedicated to like your morning activities with preschool, they'll know exactly where to sit and they know exactly where to look, because it's very common that if you have them sitting on the rug, they'll be looking everywhere except where you want them to look. So if you have a dedicated spot, like, hey, this is where we're going to do our class, they're going to know exactly what to do. And again, they'll know what to expect from your class. So with this being said about arrivals, we're going to talk a little bit more about what do you do when you dismiss your students. Like when they come to your classroom, if you have the procedures ready, if you pretty much like follow that routine every class, they're going to follow it. And that's going to save you a lot of time. And when I say it saves you a lot of time, that means you'll have more time to actually teach your lesson and not go over procedures and other things. So if we can move on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about dismissal. So when we talk about dismissal, you need to have clear expectations about what your students need to do before leaving. For younger students, how do your students line up when they are dismissed? Are they listening to your instructions, or are they listening to the instructions of their homeroom teacher? For example, in my case, their homeroom teacher picks up the students in my classroom. So they have the Spanish teacher and they have their classroom teacher. Who are they going to listen to? Are you still going to give them instructions, or are they going to listen to the instructions of their classroom teacher? That is very important for you to figure out, like, who's the boss once you dismiss them. Another thing that's important, like if you have any behavior concerns, who takes care of that? Like if you had a student who was a little bit disruptive, who was not listening, who was not following instructions, do you address that as, as like the boss of your class? Or do you share that with the homeroom teacher, and the homeroom teacher takes care of that? That's also very important to know, like, who is going to pretty much take care of that once your class is over. So that's something that you need to figure out, or to come to an agreement with the classroom teacher to see who's going to take care of those things. But it's very important, like dismissal, it takes a couple of weeks till they get it, but just as arrival is important, their dismissal is important too, because that's when, sometimes like they want to go, or sometimes, like, I don't know if your classes are before their recess or before their lunch and they're ready just to go. So it's very important for you to have clear expectations about how you're going to dismiss them in class. So if we can go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about an example of a word language class routine. And this is a 30-minute class. This is mostly for kindergarten to second grade, maybe. The younger ages, if you have a 30-minute class, this is an example of what we do in our lessons. So we can go to the next slide. For my little students, we always use a song as a warm-up activity. I have a list of 3 to 5 songs to sing with my students. I choose songs about weather, calendar, colors, or any useful vocabulary that you're working on. If you have a unit about family, choose a song about family. If you have a unit about colors, choose a song about colors. Pay attention to the songs that your students don't like too much and switch them for songs that are more engaging. With this being said, like, this is like when you're trying like to sell the class to your students. This is when you tell them, like, we're going to have a good time here. So it's very important for you to pick up songs that your students like, that they're easy for them to sing. That's another important thing. You can create movements for the songs, because a lot of students will get frustrated if they don't know what they're singing. They'll be like, okay, I'm trying to dance, but I don't know what I'm saying. And as learners of a second language, we know how frustrating it is when, like, the beat of a song is really good, but you don't know what you're singing. Like, you want to try to do your best and try to sing. So as children, they want to know what the song is saying. And adding movements or gestures to the song can be very helpful. You can also add props to the song, or you can bring flashcards so the students know exactly what the song is about. So we can move on to our next activity, our next slide. So these are some songs that you can find like in Abigail. Abigail has a song like for pretty much every other unit. They have a song about like this one, for example, is about fruits. So it's important for them like to, if they are learning, for example, in this case, a unit about fruits, incorporate a song about fruits and make it part of your routine. Like even if like, you're learn about colors, if the song says something about colors, include the song too. So this is another song about colors in French. So try to incorporate songs that have concepts that your students are going to be using on not only for that isolated unit, but are going to use it later as you progress in your curriculum. So we're going to move on to our next slide. And another thing that we do is that we review basic concepts like colors, feelings, our calendar, or again, anything that we need to review from a previous activity or a previous unit. We can review it. And what we do is that you're going to pick 2 or 3 basic concepts to review. Like if you want to review something about a previous class, you can do that. If you want to review colors, you can do that. If you want to review calendars, if you want to review numbers, if you want anything that you want to review, pick 2 or 3 concepts. And you can do any of these activities. For example, you can use flashcards. And when I say flashcards, it has to be something very simple. Just print a picture and that's your flashcard. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can play Magic Box. If you're not familiar with the Magic Box routine, this is, you get like a gift box. And what you do is that you put inside that gift box, you put an item related to the unit. For example, if you're talking about clothes, let's say you put a scarf, and then you give your students clues about what's in the box. So what you do is that you're going to start asking questions for your students to answer. Your students are going to start asking you questions, and you're going to just answer those questions, and they're going to guess. If you have students who have very novice level, they're going to be like yes or no answers. If your students are a little bit more advanced, you can ask like more elaborated questions. You can also play a guessing game with the flashcards. These are from Abigail, and they have a lot of like cutout activities that you can use those as flashcards. You can use those as a memory game too. Another thing you can do with flashcards is that you can hide them and you can ask students to find them. This is a very interesting activity because if you have like a unit with like 6 or 8 words, you can tell your students, okay, I have 6 words that I hid here in the classroom, and I want you guys to find them. So your students are going to find the flashcards related to the unit. So that's another interesting game, but please remember where you hide the flashcards, because what happened to me one time, we were doing a Christmas unit and there was one card that we could not find, and my students found the card, I think like somewhere around Easter. So it's always important to remember where you hide the cards so your students can find them. And finally, you can also read a book to review a concept. You can pick up any book that has any theme or any topic that you would like to review, and you can review that concept with a book. So we can go to our next activity, next slide. Then what we do in preschool classes is that we have an introduction, or we review the unit. So you can review vocabulary, expressions, or any content of your current unit, and you're going to choose 1 or 2 activities. You can choose a video, you can choose books. Again, you can choose flashcards. Remember, at this age, preschool and early elementary, students are very visual. So they need to make that connection of what you're saying to an image so they can start internalizing that word or that vocabulary that you're trying to share. So it's very important for you to have visual aids for your students. You can also use props. Props are like anything that your students can manipulate and create stories. or you can always use game. So pick any of this, choose one or two activities. If you're talking, for example, about greetings, you can use flashcards and you can pick one of the games with flashcards. If you are teaching about colors, you can choose a video about colors. So it's very important for you to keep a good variety of resources that you're going to use in your classroom to keep your students engaged. We can go to our next slide. And here are some examples of some easy low prep games, because sometimes as educators, when you hear the word games, you're like, okay, now I have to cut, I have to glue, I have to laminate. Not really. There are a lot of games that you can do that they're not going to require that much preparation from you. So who has it? I have it, or quien tiene yo tengo in Spanish, is that you give students flashcards or props, and then you start calling them out. For your younger students, you can just call out the word. For older students, you can just start giving descriptions of what you're looking for. Que me falta? Same thing. You present all your vocabulary or all your flashcards, ask your students to cover their eyes, and then you're going to take out one word, and they have to guess what's the word that's missing. And freeze dance, which is one of my students' favorites, is that you play a song and then you pause it, and then you select one student, and that student is going to answer the question. If the student answered the questions correctly, he has the power to unfreeze the whole class. So it's a very interesting game. If you see that the question that you're asking your student does not guess it, you can start giving them options. Like if that depends on the level of your student. Like if you say, for example, okay, the apple is blue or is it red? Okay, it's red. So if you see that it's a very novice level, you can always give them options instead of giving them open-ended questions. So we can move on to our next activity. Keep in mind that, and I always talk about this, your unit should not be loaded with vocabulary. You want to focus on expressions and high frequency words and verbs in any language, because it's always better if you know just maybe the name of 6 fruits, but you know to express likes and dislikes, wants and needs, that if you know the name of 20 fruits, but you do not know how to say which one you like or which one you dislike. The ideal number is 6 to 8 vocabulary words for your theme unit. And again, remember to reinforce high frequency words and expressions instead of just unit of your vocabulary from your unit. Okay, we can move on to our next activity, next slide. I cannot get out of the teacher mode. I keep saying activity. So remember to read your students' cues, read their body language. The cues could be many and they could be so different depending on your group. Mostly students start talking, squirming, moving, or being out of task. This means most of the times they're ready to switch to another activity or they might need a break. Sometimes we're like, oh no, this class is, they are talkative or they are this, but sometimes we need to also think as educators, okay, maybe I need to switch something. Maybe I need to move on to another activity, or maybe I need to do something different. So it's very important to keep that in mind, that sometimes their body language might be telling us that, hey, it's time to move on to our next activity. So we can move on to our next. And finally, you can ask questions to your students, and you can do it as a game. You can do a final review with questions. Your students can work on a short final activity. You can do a short worksheet or a craft activity, and we'll talk about craft activities in a little bit. You can choose a book or a short video related to your unit to review, or you can always read a book to close your unit. So these are some options that you can keep in mind if you are looking to close your activity. So now we're going to talk very briefly about craft activities, because that's like a buzzing word lately for all world language teachers. So I'm going to share with you about some craft activities if we want to move on to the next slide. So let's make sure your craft activity has a purpose. Decorating a bulletin board, a cute picture for social media is not a purpose. So especially if you only have like 20, 30, 40 minutes of class, you need to use that class time in order to start producing language or to expose your students to language. So This is like my Hall of Shame craftivities from my first year of teaching. On the left, that was a Thanksgiving Day craftivity that had no purpose at all. In the middle, that was a bulletin board that, again, had no purpose. And the last one was a gingerbread house that, again, it was cute. My students were supposed to hear the instructions in Spanish, but it all failed. So make sure if you have a craftivity, that's a word that we keep hearing a lot because it's a craft and it's activity. But what's the purpose? It has to have a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, then you might want to find something else to use in your class. So we can move to the next slide, and we are going to be talking about an example for lower and upper elementary world language class routines. So we're talking about like third grade to sixth grade. Some schools, I know that their middle school starts in fifth grade. Some other schools, they start in sixth grade. So these are more activities that you can use from third to sixth grade in your world language classes. So again, we can have some easy low prep games. Like remember with preschool, we were starting with a song. Now this age is a little interesting because they're not too old to understand complex words or instructions, but they do not want to be treated like babies. Like if you come up with something so childish, they'll be like, we're not babies, we're treating us like babies. So it's very important for you to find that balance. And okay, they want to play some games, but let's not make them too childish or too babyish, like they say. So it's important that when you start your class, you have a warm-up activity. And here are some games that you can play with them. So fly swatter, or in Spanish, we call it mata moscas. You place flashcards on the board and give your two students a fly swatter, and they have to hit the word that you called out. Again, depending on the level of your students, you can either just give descriptions or you can just call out the words. If you just call out the words, make sure you're using the words in context. Like if we're talking about clothes, you're going to say like, where is the pink skirt? And your students are going to find the pink skirt. If your students are talking about fruit, where is the red apple? So they're going to find the red apple. So it's important to have those words in context. If your students are older, if your students have more an intermediate level, you're going to start giving clues. Like for example, this is a fruit that is big, it's green on the outside, it's red on the inside. What's its fruit? Okay, watermelon. So they're going to find the watermelon. So it's important to adapt these activities depending on the level of your students. So my next activity is find your match. Again, with flashcards, you're going to have two sets of flashcards and you're going to give a flashcard to each student and they're going to find their match. So when they find each other in Spanish, lo tengo means I have it. So you can adapt that to your language, to any language that you're teaching. And it's very important when you do these activities in groups to give your students a very clear instruction, like, hey, once you find your match, like write a small sentence about, like if we're talking about clothes, like if two students find each other and they both have like a picture of a jacket, hey, write a sentence about someone who's wearing a jacket, or write a sentence about a jacket that you have at home. Like give them an additional instruction so that way you can keep like control, classroom control while everybody else is finishing the activity. And another activity that you can do is left or right, that you're going to have two flashcards and you hide your flashcards behind your back, and then your student has to guess like where is the flashcard that you're calling out. So this is a very interesting activity that it's very low prep, and you can start introducing vocabulary in a very fun and engaging way. So we can move on to our next slide. And so after you do this warm-up activity, you're going to have a group or a very creative activity. So these are activities where your students can explore that creative side of them. So some activities that they can do is guess the word and make a picture. This is one of my favorite activities. Like before you start a unit, before you introduce anything, you give your students some of the vocabulary words, and you have to be very clear with them. You say like, these are new words, like you're not expected to know these words. Like if you make a mistake, that's okay, that's fine. So you give your students, each student, you give them a word, and they're going to draw whatever they think that word means. Of course, they're going to relate it to their first language. Like, for example, I'm a Spanish teacher, and the word was vendedora. So I had a student who his first language is English. So when I told him like, hey, what do you think vendedora is? He's like, well, I think that it's a Dora the Explorer inside a vending machine. That's how he pictured the word vendedora, which it actually means salesperson in Spanish. But that's the way he pictured the word. And for me, it was like, hey, we're celebrating that, you're doing that language connection, and that, we're all just here trying to have a good time introducing new words and trying to start a unit. So this is a very fun activity. If you want to, have your student guess the word and make a picture of whatever they think that word means, it's going to be a very fun activity. Another thing you can do is that you can create your own memory game. Your students can create cards of the vocabulary words, and they can play memory. And this is going to be a very interesting activity because it's something that they created together. So it's going to be very meaningful to them. You can also finish a comic story. Here we have some examples for French teachers that you can just give them the pictures and they can start creating the comic story. You can draw a bingo board for all the vocabulary words that you have. Remember, if you have a bingo board, you can always ask students to label the pictures, or you can ask them to write a sentence for each picture. Find someone who activities that we know that, you have like a 3x3 grid, and you can put questions for your students. For example, find someone who's wearing a jacket, find someone who is wearing a skirt, find someone who is wearing a scarf. So they're going to start looking for people, or they can start asking questions. So find someone who activities are very engaging, and they're also going to keep your students working and talking to each other, hopefully in the target language. But for find someone who activities, it's very important that you are monitoring these activities so they can stay in the target language. And finally, you can always give your student a short story with cognates and ask them to illustrate it. For example, here we have another example in Capsud, and you can see that these stories have cognates, have words that students can match them to their first language. So it's very important that you give them that little help, give them that help so they can understand the story by making that connection to their first language. So we can move on to our next slide. And another thing that you can do is that you can find an extra component or an extra activity for that unit that you're working on. You can find a video or a book to support your unit. You can ask questions before starting to use a component. For example, you can say like, hey, like on this image, I want you to find like someone who's greeting a friend, find someone who's saying good morning, find someone who's saying hello. So give them specific things that you want them to find, either in the book, in the video, in the illustration. For example, I've been checking Abigail as a Spanish teacher at the beginning of each unit. They have like this huge, like 2 pages with a lot of illustrations, and there is so much you can do from that. Like you can ask them questions, you can ask them to find this, or you can ask them to like, hey, like let's like role play this, or you can do so many things. Like you can have like just one class just focus on like, let's find this, or what do you think is going to happen in this story, or what do you think she's telling him, or a lot of things. So the possibilities are endless, but it's very important that again, you are the one who's asking the questions so they can find it, and they can support whatever unit or whatever theme you're doing with your classroom. That we can move over to our next slide. And another thing that you can do, and this is probably one of my students' favorite activities, is that you can showcase your students' work. So for this, your students are going to create a personalized activity to showcase whatever they're learning. So here are some ideas that you can do. For older students, you can do like describe your favorite part of the story. If you read a book, if you watch a video, describe your favorite part. You can also ask them to create a dialogue. Like, for example, in the picture that we just saw, you can say like, hey, I need you to pick two people and create a dialogue between these two people. Even if it's like a 6 lines conversation, like imagine what might happen if these two people start talking. If you're working on food, you can create a menu. If you're talking about descriptions or family, create a story. You can always add an additional character to a story. Like, hey, what do you think if there's this X character who comes into the story? You can create a t-shirt if you're talking about clothes, designs, a bedroom, decorate something. Again, the possibilities are endless, but what we want is that we want to showcase what our students know, what our students have learned, and it's always important for them to share with their classmates. So this is an example from Abigail, and what happens here is that students are going to create a poster about their favorite season, and they're going to share with their students. Abigail, at the end of each unit, they have a small project where they practice Spanish, they practice everything they learn in the unit. So this is a great way of like closing not only a lesson, but a whole unit for your students to showcase what they know, what they've learned using the target language. This is a great opportunity for them to share with their classmates. We can move on to our next slide. And again, for younger students, we can do something a little bit more different. See, for older students, we are always describing, writing. Younger students, some of them are not there yet, especially if you see them just once a week, like for 30 or 40 minutes. But they can still, for example, they can draw their favorite part of the story. Like, we read a story. What was your favorite part of the story? If you watched the video, what was your favorite part of the video? Maybe they're not yet to write about it, but maybe they can describe it to their friends. If you give them the tools to describe something, they might be able to do it. So it's very important for you to encourage them to do this, encourage them to talk to, speaking a target language, presenting to their friends. These are very good projects that you can do at the end of the unit. Who was your favorite character of the story? You can always role play your favorite character of the story. Kids love to like get out of like their personalities and adopt a new personality. They absolutely love that. So role playing a story, role playing a video, role playing a character from a book is going to be something that's going to be very interesting to them. It's going to really open up their eyes, and it's going to, more than anything, it's going to encourage them to present something in the target language, because they're adapting the personality of somebody else. Something that I've encountered also is that I've been teaching like the same students. For example, my sixth graders, I know mostly all of them since they were in pre-K. So they already know their names. They already know who are their parents, their pets. They know everything about them. So like when we're doing the All About Me unit, they don't want to talk about themselves because they already know everything about each other. So why don't we make them adapt another personality, another character, and they can present themselves as a character. So that is something that we can always keep in mind to allow our students to role play, to explore other characters, because they already know each other for so many years. So that's something that, for example, this fortune teller from Abigail, it allows them to like be another character, like to choose a character, so they can always like introduce themselves as that character or pretend they are that character. In that way, they'll be using the expressions and all the vocabulary that they'll learn, but not as themselves, but as somebody else. And again, our students are very creative. They can always like make mini books and choose 2 to 3 vocabulary words and share with their classmates. Again, when you want to showcase your students' work, It's kids love to share with their classmates, most of them. So it's very important for you to give them that opportunity to share with their classmates. But it's also important for us as educators to have certain kind of rubric, like what are we expecting for them? It's very important when we're doing this showcasing or presentations activities for us to say like, hey, like this is what I expect from you. Like I want you to, don't pretend like this is like some game or something like we're going to be playing. This is like a class time and this is important. So it's very important for us to establish very clear expectations about what we expect from our students. So we can move on to our next slide. A class activity, remember that it's always important for you to give your students the tools that they need for them to complete their tasks. If you follow me on Instagram, I'm a fan of giving vocabulary lists to my students, especially if you see them once a week. You are allowed to give them those tools. Just do it. Model the activity, small things that you might think, oh, it's cut and paste. They might know how to do it. They might, but it's always important to model the activity for your students. Use cognates in reading. Cognates, we know, are those words that sound very similar in the first language of your students. So try to use those a lot in your classes and use a lot of visual aids. These are some examples of Alba Gael. This is an activity from the workbook. But for example, if I want to use that activity, I would love to give my students this vocabulary list for them to work on that activity. It is perfectly fine because it's a tool for them to excel, succeed, and complete the activity in class. So we can move on to our next slide. So here I'm going to share some useful activities that you can use for all ages. And again, these are activities that you can use for any unit, any level, any age, absolutely everybody. The only thing that's going to change is like the level of like difficulty, like how challenging you want to make these activities. So we already talked about the first one, find someone who are activities that you can do like in a 3x3 grid. Depending on your theme, you can start asking questions like, okay, find someone who has a dog, find someone who has a cat, find someone who does not have any pets. So you customize the questions depending on your unit and on your student's age and level. You create your own memory game cards. Again, this is a very interesting activity because your students are creating them and it's going to be more fun than, something that's already created and that something, if it's a memory game that they did, it's going to be more engaging and it's going to be much more meaningful for them. A group story, if you're familiar with like storytelling, a group story, you start with just like a small sentence and your students start creating the story. If I'm talking about animals, I can say, once upon a time, there was an animal and and then a student tells me it was a dog. Okay, and the dog lived in California. Okay, and the dog was looking for a girlfriend. Okay, they can come up with like all these ideas, but it's a story that the students are going to create. And once they create the story, they can either write it or they can either illustrate it. So it's a very fun activity to do once your students have, the vocabulary that they need. Draw your own bingo board. You will know how to play bingo, but it's always fun for them to choose their own pictures. And again, you can always add some sentences or words in context. Find the flashcard. We already explained that game. You hide the flashcards in your classroom and ask your students to find them. Magic box, it's another activity. You have you have an item related to your unit, and then you hide it in the box and you start asking questions. Your students have to guess what's on the box. Pictionary, it's always a fan favorite. It's a class favorite. Pictionary, you're going to start drawing and your students have to guess the word. But remember, you always have to use everything in context. Like they have to give you the words in context and fly swatter or matamoscas that you are going to put flashcards on the board, and then your students have to find the word that you call out. Depending on the level and age of your students, you can use words in context, or you can start giving descriptions.
So, Josefina, the first question we have is, where can I find some good songs matching with the units?
I can tell you, like, the ones that I saw from Alba Gael, I like because they're themes that units that we see as Spanish teachers, like family, fruits, colors, numbers. They have a little bit of everything. For preschool, one of my favorites is called Music with Sarah, and she has songs in Spanish and she has songs in English, but that's more like for preschool. For elementary, I really like the ones from Alba Gael. I've been using them a little bit with my students. They seem to like it. I tell you something, if your students like it, it's a win. Like, always go with that. Like, if they like it, it's a good to go.
Absolutely. Just so you guys know, Alba Guide is one of our programs. This is our elementary Spanish program. Someone asked before, and for Spanish, this is like our main one. We also have for French Cap Sur, and for German Die Deutsch Profis. I have no German, so I'm sorry if the pronunciation was not good. And I'm gonna put the links in a second in case you want to explore them further, and the link for a free sample in case you want to take a look at it. I'm gonna mention that again in a few seconds. Our next question is regarding to the vocabulary you mentioned. Of course, you said that it's better to have like shorter vocabulary and then they can actually use it instead of having like 20 words for different fruits and then not being able to actually do real life interactions. And someone asks about the 6-8 words you mentioned. For how long should it be like this?
So I've always like talked about this, like how many words you should have, especially if you see, like, I see my students once a week. So what I do is for kindergarten to second grade, we do 6 to 8 words per unit. Our units last 1 month. And then starting from fourth grade to sixth grade, we do between 8 to like 12, no more than 15, depending on like how much more you see them. Like, my middle school classes are 1 hour, so we have more time to cover more. So I would say stick to like 6 to 8 for your younger learners, and do like 8 to 12, maybe 15 for older ages for each unit. Now, these are vocabulary words, like, not the expressions or like high frequency words. You want to, yeah, pay attention to vocabulary, but always like use them in context. I don't know if that answers the question.
Perfect. Then this is not marked as a question, but perhaps we could expand this idea, which is it's a phrase that says that you can usually adapt or personalize most of these activities to any language. What could you say about this?
Uh, I would say that you will have to see what are like the standards, the language standards for like your state. Like, what are the themes or topics that they're expected from you to cover? Like in Spanish, like we start with all about me, then we go with family, we go with descriptions, like we have an order. So I would say that you have to see like, what are your expectations as a teacher? What do you want to cover? And then you can adapt those activities. Like, if you're talking about, I don't know, for example, descriptions, and you have a very limited time, just maybe do descriptions for like, like in singular. Don't go to like plural yet, and just save it maybe for your next unit. So the I would say like the thing about adapting it, it depends, like it's very complex because it depends on every teacher. Like, how many times a week do you see your students? What does your curriculum look like? What do you have to cover every month? What are your expectations when your students finish the school year? So based on that, you can adapt the activities. Another thing, you can adapt it to any language. Like, as as bilingual, or some of us like trilingual people, we know exactly what we need when we travel to another country. So think about that. Like, when you travel to another country, what do you need in order to communicate, and kind of like use those words to give your students the tools they need to learn a new language.
Perfect. Thank you. Now coming back to vocabulary again. So colors and numbers would not be considered as vocabulary. Someone asks, what would the high frequency words would be?
I personally use numbers, colors, weather, and days of the week and months of the year. We use that as like our morning routine. It's not like an isolated thing. It's not an isolated unit. So we decide to review those like at the beginning of our classes. So it's not an isolated theme. It's something that we do every day, like in every class. So for example, for colors, you can use like pretty much like any like high frequency word or expression, like what color is de qué color es, or you can use the verb encuentra, like find something. For numbers, of course, it's going to be talking about ages, talking about your age. And then numbers is something that you can use like for every unit. Like if you talk about fruits, like count how many fruits are here. If you talk about clothes, like how much is this? So colors, numbers, days of the week, weather, and months of the year. Personally, I don't do them as an isolated unit. It's something that we do every class because it's something that is, as grown-ups, we use that thing like every day. So I try to make it like a routine theme for my students.
Awesome. And then another question we have is, how long does it take to get through a unit or a book if you meet every day for an hour, more or less, for example?
Again, that depends on like how many minutes you have every week, what's the level of your students, how many students you have, how many holidays you have on your school calendar. So it really depends a lot on like your schedule. Personally, I do one unit per month because my students kind of like get bored if we talk about the same thing for like 4 classes. So what you can do as an educator is that you can recycle that content in your next unit. Like if we're doing, for example, we have our unit about family. Right after that, we have a unit about the house. Then our following unit is my family in the house, and we start adding verbs. So as an educator, it's not like, hey, like I talk about family and then I forget about this and then I move into our next unit. You need to kind of like carry those words, that unit, that topic to your next class, to your next month. So we do, for example, family, we do our home, then we do our family, my family in my home, where we do verbs, then we do home pets, and then we add everything. We add like my family in my home with my home pets and the verbs. So you are recycling everything. And that way, it's not like we learn about family and we forget about it. Like you're still reviewing everything, but your students don't get bored with the same unit.
Perfect. Let's see. I think we just got. Okay. And how long is the morning routine?
With my preschoolers, we do our songs, which is like 5 minutes. And then we do our calendar. And then we review either colors or numbers. So I would say it will be like 10 minutes. It will be 10 minutes. Because again, I only see them once a week. So for example, if I see my kindergarten students on Tuesday, like I don't want them to only know how to say Tuesday. Like martes is the only day that they're going to know. Like, no, I want them to know like at least the other days too. So it's important for me like to keep repeating that every class. And you'll see that once you stick to a routine, if you ever try to change it, your students will tell like, hey, we didn't do the calendar, or hey, we skipped the song, because students love routine, especially the little ones. They thrive on routine. So you will notice like if they know exactly where to sit, if you know exactly what to do, if you start doing it by August and you stick to it, I'll tell you about like the last weeks of September, they'll know exactly what to do. They're like little robots. They know what to do, but you have to stick to it and you have to like encourage them to follow the routine. But usually it takes me like 10 minutes between the songs and the calendar.
Great. So I believe this is the next is going to be our last question, which is what are your recommendations, websites and non-websites to find different kinds of materials for students?
Well, I've been using some of the Abigail for my older students, and they like, for example, like the first pages. I think I told you about like the first 2 pages of Abigail. It shows like a big picture that you can create a lot of activities from that, because you want them to start talking in the target language. So that could be a good start for you. Like if you wanted to start talking, if you want to expose them more to their vocabulary and words, that could be a good start. But I encourage you to also like start creating something that you see your students might like. For example, again, like a bingo board. If you create like a 3x3 grid, invite your students to create their own bingo board. Like, hey, we have like these words. Like, I need you to draw your own bingo board. Students are very creative. Encourage them to, do their own memory games. You'll be surprised of like how creative they are, and also like how much more fun is for them to work on something that they created. And of course, as a teacher, you'll have more time to do other things like teach your class and not spend too much time, working on resources or prepping resources. So I encourage you to try to explore that creativity of your students, because some of us sometimes you'll get surprised to see like what your students can create once you give them that chance to create something. They love to create. They absolutely love to create, and once you display their work, it's just like the best thing for them.
That's fantastic, Josefina. So again, thank you very much. That was indeed the last question. I just want to connect with what you say, and besides thanking you again, uh, of course, as you know, these are our elementary programs. Albegal is from Clever Languages, just as Capsule, which we also saw some examples in the presentation, DDoS Profis, and we would really want to invite you to request a free sample, because you can see that big page Josefina was just talking about. You can see all the graphics, all the images, some of the examples and the activities we have. So we do want to invite you to try that out. For that, as for any of our other materials, Capsule also has some beautiful graphics. DDoS Profis, I don't know German, but it looks beautiful as well. So we do want to invite you for that. That being said, I think this is everything. So again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Josefina, for the amazing insight, and I hope you'll have a great rest of your evening.